So bad. The government there appears to have given up on achieving zero community transmission, at least for now. In a moment, we'll take a look at what that means for intensive care units as admissions to hospital keep climbing. And would you be more likely to get a vaccine if you were paid for it? We'll take a look at the proposal and what the data tells us about incentives. Well, once again, more than half the country's population is in lockdown. Victoria says it's in a precarious position as the state deals with an outbreak of the Delta variant. It's expected exposure sites will spread across Melbourne and into regional Victoria as the case numbers grow. There's better news in Queensland. Authorities there believe lockdown measures are working, but say it's still too early to ease restrictions. But the situation in New South Wales is still grim. It's recorded its highest daily number of cases ever, almost 300, and that number is expected to climb.
The health system is under stress, as you'd expect, because there are a number of cases that are coming into our hospitals, and obviously there are patients being cared for.
Our reporter Ursula Malone is in Sydney and joins us now. Ursula, the New South Wales Premier says the flattening of the curve they were hoping for just isn't happening.
Sadly, that's right, Jeremy. I've been having a look back at the figures for this week, and if we take a look at those figures, it was 207 new cases on Monday. Then on Tuesday, there was a ray of hope as the cases dipped just below 200 at 199. But by Wednesday, they were back over 200 again, 233. Yesterday, it got up to 262, and then today, 291 cases. That's the highest number we've seen yet in this outbreak. Now that makes a total of 4,610 cases since the middle of June. And worryingly, we're still seeing a large number of those cases were out and about in the community during the period that they were infectious. Now, and there was a warning from the New South Wales Premier today that we should expect to see those high numbers continue over the next few days. Now, sadly, there was another death to report. A woman in her 60s has died at Liverpool Hospital in southwest Sydney. It's believed that she contracted the virus from a staff member at the hospital, and it's the second death connected with that outbreak at the hospital. Now, there were 2 new cases reported in Newcastle, which brings to 7 the total number of cases there, but no new cases found on the Central Coast, so the total there remains at 9. Now, as you mentioned, there was a candid admission today, the first time we've really heard this, that the health system in New South Wales is under strain. And the Premier said it's really the Delta strain that is so much more infectious. That's really what's putting the health system under such strain as more people are being admitted to hospital with COVID. And one example she gave was that at a single KFC outlet in southwest Sydney, 12 staff members there have all tested positive for COVID.
Ursula Malone reporting, thank you. Let's bring in Mark Nichols, who's an ICU doctor and the Vice President of the Australian and New Zealand Intensive Care Society. Mark Nichols, welcome to the program. We've just heard the New South Wales Health Minister make that admission today that the health system is unsurprisingly under a lot of stress right now. Where should that leave the public's confidence in hospitals right now as this surge continues to grow?
To be honest, I think we should be confident. I mean, we've got a world-class hospital system and a world-class intensive care sort of system as well. And we've been planning for this since the pandemic started. So just with my society, so the Australian and New Zealand Intensive Care Society, we've been planning back at the end of January. We provided the surge capacity data to the government in February. That was last year. And then a group of around 50 intensive care specialists across the country were involved in writing guidelines that were informative for every hospital across the country in terms of surging, in terms of pandemic planning. So sort of a tiered approach to as numbers increase. And also the initial guidelines had a focus on staff safety and well-being. So we had a sustainable workforce.
You've treated patients who've got COVID. What condition are they in when they arrive in hospital, and how do you go about trying to save them?
80% of patients will stay home, and about 20% of patients will end up needing to come to hospital. So they identify those patients, and then those patients get admitted to hospital, and then they get started on oxygen. And then some of those patients have increasing oxygen requirements and then need to move to the intensive care unit for closer observation. And so we've got a phased ability to watch patients coming as they deteriorate. And if the patients deteriorate further in intensive care, we use things such as high flow nasal oxygen, non-invasive ventilation, and in some cases, in 30% of cases, we end up actually intubating the patients. And that's where we put a tube into the mouth with a cuff and then connect them to a ventilator.
These are pretty confronting circumstances, and we're seeing this occur to younger and younger patients as well, aren't we?
Yeah, to be honest, this is something that we've done all our working careers. So looking after the sickest of patients is something that intensive care specialists and intensive care nurses have done the whole of their professional working lives. And so it's something that we've developed a set of skills and abilities to do that. Yes, this is unprecedented. Yes, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and ultimately intensive care is at the forefront in a sense, because we will get those sickest patients, but we have put plans in place and we're ready for surging, but this ultimately comes down to everybody in the community has to be responsible and has to help the hospital system and has to help the intensive care units. And the way they do that is they need to, when they have an opportunity, is to get vaccinated.
A woman in her 60s has died after contracting COVID at Liverpool Hospital in Sydney. How effectively can people who are going to hospital with other comorbidities, other conditions, suppressed immune systems, be shielded and protected from outbreaks at places like Liverpool Hospital?
There's a number of ways in which you shield patients who don't have COVID from being infected. And so that's part of what we call administrative controls. And also environmental controls. So what we do is we end up with certain workflows at the point of admission to hospital, for instance, to the emergency department. And then patients, if they've got respiratory symptoms, will be assumed to have COVID to be proved otherwise. And if they're not, then they get put into a place that has a low incidence or low chance of having COVID. And so that's how we're protecting people within the emergency department, but there's also similar processes throughout the hospital, including intensive care. So in intensive care, we have, what we will do is we'll have a dedicated space, a dedicated area where we look after the patients with COVID, and then we'll have a dedicated space where we look after patients who don't have COVID, who've got other medical conditions that we need to look after in intensive care.
Mark Nichols, it's so good to talk to you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
As we've heard, healthcare workers and leaders across the country are pleading for more people to get vaccinated. Dr. Katie Atwell from the University of Western Australia specialises in vaccination policy, and she joins us now. Dr. Atwell, thank you for joining us. 80% is the magic number that National Cabinet has agreed to. Is that a realistic level of uptake?
Well, at this point, clearly not, because we don't have supply for those people yet. I'm hopeful, I remain hopeful that we can get up there through a range of strategies, but it is going to be a challenge.
And when can we get there?
Well, that's really going to be a question of supply. It's really going to be about having those vaccines here in the country for the younger population, for whom in most states are still being recommended to wait for Pfizer.
Talk me through some of those strategies you mentioned, because one of the ideas being floated right now is this idea of paying people to get vaccinated. Do incentives like that work?
They've been used historically in this country for childhood vaccination, but in a way where people who didn't want to vaccinate and were able to opt out could still actually access those resources as well. So the issue here is whether an incentive feels like a bribe to people. And certainly the research we've done in Western Australia through our CoronaVax project has indicated that some people feel quite uncomfortable with the idea of an incentive, particularly if it's a fairly large amount of money, which I guess $300 is for a lot of people. If that's going to make you do something you wouldn't otherwise do, that doesn't seem like a very good way to engage in public health or pro-social behaviour.
What about the non-financial incentive? I mean, the risk profile, particularly for a place like New South Wales right now, is elevated. Does that influence the uptake?
It absolutely does, and so does the changing advice. So, for example, the fact that younger people are now recommended in New South Wales to get whatever vaccine they can, which predominantly would be AstraZeneca. So changing risk profile, changing advice does encourage people to go and get vaccinated. But even people I'm talking to here in Western Australia, where they might not be able to get their hands on Pfizer yet, I do know also of young people who are going out to get AstraZeneca as well.
And that's despite the level of risk in the community right now in WA being a fair bit lower than it is in New South Wales.
That's right. But I mean, we just had a little scare. There was a guy who had a weak positive case. We all see where this guy's been. And of course, whenever you find out about these people, they seem like they've been everywhere. So, I feel like we're a whisker away from being in this sort of situation of our eastern states counterparts. And I imagine a lot of other West Australians feel the same.
The Prime Minister is saying he trusts Australians to understand the necessity of getting vaccinated without a financial incentive. You've researched the issue of trust and lifestyle-based hesitancy. What have you learned about the barrier they pose and how to get around that?
So I would say that the situation we're facing with COVID vaccines is different from the vaccine hesitancy and refusal I've researched in the past with parents who were quite fringe and alternative lifestyle in their beliefs, rejecting various other forms of medication or mainstream schooling, things like that. We're seeing larger numbers of people being hesitant around the COVID vaccines, understandably because they still feel like the vaccines are new. And of course, as we've already talked about in Australia, people are not necessarily feeling as under siege from the disease itself. So the vaccine might feel scary, even though if we kind of are in a setting where the disease is around, the disease pretty soon starts to feel incredibly scary as well, much more scary. So I would say that the hesitancy we're looking at for COVID-19 vaccines needs to be dealt with by having clear communication and information. And this is really close to my heart, actually, because this morning I just spent a couple of hours doing focus groups with women from diverse cultural backgrounds in the northern suburbs of Perth. And the lack of information these women are encountering and the hesitancy that's moving around their circles was really sobering to encounter, and just really brought home to me how much work government needs to do to make sure that these people who are not fluent in English are able to access information about vaccine safety, about why they should be vaccinated, about how to get vaccinated, how to engage with booking systems. We need to make it so much easier for people.
Now, what role does business have here? You will have heard of SPC, the fruit canning company, announcing it will insist on all staff and visitors being vaccinated, I think, by the end of the year. What do you think about that mandating of vaccines?
So my position on mandates is that they are better when they're brought in by government rather than by companies. When it's government telling companies to do it, I think that has a stronger message. I also think that it has more legitimacy because we're accountable. Our governments are elected by us, so they have a higher level of legitimacy. When companies do it, it may create risk of reactance and pushback from their staff, although that's not to say that certain staff wouldn't need to be vaccinated in particular settings. But this SPC case will be the first of its kind in the country, and we'll have to see whether the employees are happy to be vaccinated. I certainly think that the measures SPC are taking with regard to giving their staff time off to be vaccinated and time off if they should pull up a little bit sore or a little bit unwell the next day is exactly the kind of measure we want to be seeing. And I'd like to see businesses introducing those sorts of measures to support vaccination in their staff, regardless of whether they're mandating it. In fact, putting those policies in place first is a way of really making sure that people are vaccinated under conditions that feel voluntary and feel good for them. And that should be our first goal.
Dr. Katie Atwell, it's so good to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the show.
And that is the vaccine for this week. You can catch up with the show anytime on iView and the ABC's YouTube channel as well. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe.
Hello, welcome to The Road to Tokyo. I'm Tracy Holmes, coming to you from the Japanese capital. Tonight we talk to the 4-time Olympian and flag bearer for Australia, Kate Campbell, about her incredible career and maybe what's next. We catch up with Australia's newest track star, plus we hear from the inspirational weightlifter Laurel Hubbard about how she sees her place in history. The organisers of these games wanted to attract a younger and a whole new audience to the Olympics. The introduction of 4 new sports has done precisely that, especially the sport of skateboarding, with some of the youngest competitors and youngest medal winners in Games history. 18-year-old Australian Keegan Palmer won gold in the first men's park skateboarding final. Teens dominated the women's competition too. 19-year-old Sakura Yosizumi from Japan won the gold medal. She was joined on the podium by fellow countrywoman Kokona Hiraki, who is only 12, and 13-year-old Sky Brown from the UK. On the track, it wasn't quite the fairy tale we were all hoping for, but history was made, and there's plenty more to come. Runner Peter Bol was Australia's first Olympic finalist in the 800 metres in 53 years. That makes him the highest placed Australian male in a track event since Darren Clark came fourth in the 400 metres in Seoul 1988. It's been an incredibly successful Olympics for Bol, who has set 2 Australian records in the past week.
My mum did call me and said, there's a saying, she's in Arabic, because we speak Arabic, she said, "You've lifted the community's heads up." And then my dad said, "No, I think you lifted the nation's head up." And I really felt that because it's just been support from every single person, and it's just been unreal over the last 3 days. And I didn't take it as any pressure leading into the race, and I took it really as strength. And man, I just had there were just people better than me on that day. I was not nervous. I was not under pressure. I was on my game. They were just better than me, and that was it. And that's why I can be at peace with my race. Although the goal was to win, I raced the plan. I executed my race. Those guys were better on the day.
Swimmer Kate Campbell has been a mainstay of the Australian Olympic team since making her debut in Beijing 2008. Such is her commitment to her sport, Campbell stayed behind in Tokyo to participate in the IOC Athletes Commission election. Unfortunately, she just missed out this time around, so she's taking her time to consider what's next. I caught up with Kate in a noisy car park outside the Athletes Village.
For me, I believe that athletes should be at the heart and soul of what goes into creating an Olympic Games, and athletes' rights should be put forward and our voices should be heard. And I've been lucky enough to be a part of the AOC Athletes Commission for the past 6 years, and I've learned so much about what it takes to put together an Olympic Games, the little intricacies that go on within sporting organisations, and trying to bridge the gap between athletes and big sporting bodies. And I think that, compromise needs to be reached on both sides. It's given me a great appreciation for people who work in sport, but also I think that we need to consistently push athletes' agendas. And if I think that something can be done differently, I can either complain about it or I can do something about it. And doing something about it meant putting up my hand for this role.
Do you think that experience that you've had with the AOC Athletes Commission has given you a different appreciation even of this Olympic Games and the experience you've had as an athlete?
Yeah, it's given me a whole new appreciation into what it takes to put together an Australian Olympic team. Putting together an Australian Olympic team in normal times is a huge undertaking, but the amount of work that has been put into this campaign by everyone at the AOC has honestly been monumental. And I think that I appreciate so much more the opportunities that I get as an athlete because I can see how much work has been put into the back end of that. And I think that that's an important thing for athletes to recognise as well. We tend to complain about all the things that go wrong, and we don't know about all the things that did go wrong and got fixed before we got here.
Well, all the things that just go right to begin with. But talk about Tokyo, because coming in, I guess nobody really knew what to expect. And how would you compare it to your previous Olympic experiences?
I think every Olympic experience is unique. because it's kind of shaped by the culture of the country that you are in. But this game's obviously, there are very, very many layers too. And I think that this has been one of the most cohesive Australian teams that I've been a part of in a long time. And I think that there are a couple of elements to that. I think that the setup that the AOC has done at Australian headquarters is unparalleled. And it is honestly the envy of the world. And the way that they have put athlete performance first and foremost in every decision that they have made has really shone through. But then they've also thought about athletes interacting and having a good time at these games, where we wouldn't be able to go out and enjoy a lot of the things that the Olympics usually offer. And I would say also that everyone has gone through a similar struggle to get to this point. You know, I think adversity creates cohesion, and everyone has gone through something COVID related, and there's something about that that's really unifying.
That's really interesting, because we know that some of the previous Olympic Games there have been issues. I suppose at times the swimming team, if they do well, the rest of the team seems to do well, but the swimming team hasn't lived up to expectations in the past couple of games. And you talking about that cohesion, is that because, like you say, the world has gone through a pandemic? It's something bigger than us, and sometimes when we realise that out there are bigger things going on and we're not so consumed with ourselves, is that one of the elements, do you think?
Yeah, the world is bigger than sport, which is ironic saying that at one of the biggest sporting events in the world. But I think that the success of the swim team has been building for a few years now. If you look back at some of the results that we've had in the lead into these games, you'll see that there's been a momentum building. This didn't happen overnight. This didn't happen in the year off of 2020. This has been in the working for a long time, and I'm lucky enough to be on the athlete leadership group, and we have made culture really front and center of our agenda. And I think
since London, right?
Since London, and you can gradually see that. And I think that with every change, you have to have patience. We're not going to see results overnight, but it has really paid dividends. And I really hope that we've managed to create a bit of a legacy that we can hand on to future generations of Australian swimmers.
And the pool, a week ago already. I mean, it seems, it sort of takes forever to get here, and then suddenly it's just gone. What are you going to take away with you, and is it too early to talk about what's next for you? And if, Paris is only 3 years away, but what will you take away from the pool experience this time round?
I think I'm going to take away the joy that everyone took in other people's performances. And again, that really speaks to the culture of the team that we've built. Yes, it is an individual sport. Yes, we train in all different parts of Australia. We have different coaches and we do different events. But I think this time there was a real collective sense of achievement, that someone else's success was in a tiny way your success as well, and that someone else's performance or how good they do doesn't negatively impact on yourself. We were all valued equally as members of the Australian swim team, and I can think of so many moments, just little ones at the swimming pool. Probably the thing that sticks with me the most is after that medley relay on the last night, the whole Australian swim team stayed behind and waited for all four of us girls to finish our media, and they did a little victory tunnel as we came back to the warm down pool, and we came and we ran through the whole team, and none of them left, none of them went to go to the dining hall or do any of the things that they wanted to do. They wanted to be there and celebrate with us.
New Zealand weightlifter Laurel Hubbard has had more attention placed on her than most athletes here at the Olympic Games. As the first transgender woman to compete at an Olympics, the weightlifter has made history. Hubbard is now retiring from the sport. She sat down with some members of the media, including the ABC, after her event, where she was asked how she'll look back on her historic Olympic appearance in the years to come.
I suppose what I hope is, if I am in a position to look back, that this will just be a small part of history, just a small step. I know that we often look at history in terms of singular events, but really I think it's a continuum. It is, a product of so many uncountable lives and experiences, and I really hope that, with time, any significance to this occasion is diminished by years to come. All I've ever really wanted as an athlete is just to be regarded as an athlete, and I suppose the thing I've been so grateful for here in Tokyo is just being given those opportunities to just go through life as any other athlete would, and that's really what I take from this.
We all know that winners at the Olympics are celebrated, but what about for the majority of athletes that don't achieve their dreams and that go home from this event disappointed? Amin El Amri is from Le Matin Medio in Morocco. I spoke to him about the incredible highs and lows that the Olympics throws up.
Well, I think that the level of the competition, I mean, when you're passionate about sports, this is the sky high of the competition. So you can't go above Olympics. I mean, World Championships, yeah, maybe for the athletics it's every 2 years, but the Olympics is every 4 years. And there's nothing in the world, not an event that can, gather all these people. And this is what makes it so magical. And I think there's the magic of the Olympics, is the fact that the world comes together and stays together for 3, maybe 4 weeks sometimes, and especially in the middle of a pandemic, But the hardest part is seeing them, failing, trying to go to medals, and it is really hard. I mean, when you watch it from back home, it's you watch the thing, you switch off the TV, and then it's your life. You go on with your life. But here, you watch the thing, you go to the mixed zone, and you see the tears, the disappointment. It's even harder. It's even harder. I can't imagine an athlete preparing for 4 years for an Olympics and then getting there and getting kicked in the first round. It's so frustrating, even for us media who are covering. I mean, I can't imagine what it feels like for an athlete.
That you make a very good point, because a lot of the coverage that we watch and we see is the celebration of the high moments, and we don't see that most people that come to the Olympics, that's not going to be their experience.
Yeah, I know. I mean, if we would take an example in swimming, for example, or athletics, it's a tenth of a second. It's a matter of tenth of a second. I mean, tenth of a second, you could be on the podium bragging about your medal, and tenth of a second late, and you'll be in hell because you've been preparing your whole life sometimes for this event, and not getting on the podium, not getting a medal, it's a huge disappointment. I mean, I can speak about Asma Nyong, who is a judoka from Morocco. She spent 10 years being a firefighter. She laid down all of her professional career to do judo, and now after 10 years of doing judo, she had the chance. She actually had the real good chance, but she lost in the first round. So there was a mix of disappointment, frustration, not being able to look forward. It's actually the bad side of the Olympics, and nobody really speaks about that. It's really hard. Actually, Olympics can be wonderful, magical for all the guys and the girls winning, but it can be really cruel for all the others.
And that's all this week from Tokyo. I'm Tracy Holmes. See you next week.
ABC News, Australia's most trusted news source, is available anywhere, anytime on the ABC News app or the ABC News website. When a story matters to you, it matters to us. So clips from our bulletins and programs, breaking news, updates and analysis are completely free. For trustworthy news from Australia's most reliable source, download the ABC News app or visit the ABC News website.
I've reached the point now where I'm bored with this. Well, you feel trapped.
The controversial Alzheimer's drug.
It was gradual, but you could see that it was working. I could read a book again.
Will it make its way to Australia?
It slows down the decline considerably.
In my opinion, there is very little evidence and it's not clear who's going to be paying for this.
It's opened the doors. It makes you feel like you want to keep going.
7:30 next week, ABC TV, or stream it on iView.
Good morning, I'm Fawzia Ibrahim with the top stories on ABC News. The New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian is warning people to be prepared for higher COVID infection numbers over the next few days after 291 cases were recorded yesterday. Health authorities say pressure on hospitals is also building. The latest venues of concern in the state extend from Sydney's west to Newcastle CBD. While in Victoria, Health Minister Martin Foley has warned the state is in a precarious position after recording 6 local infections yesterday. More exposure sites have been listed in Melbourne overnight, and there have also been new wastewater detections. While Queensland's health authorities say a call will be made on easing restrictions tomorrow. And 2 men have suffered serious injuries after being attacked by a crocodile at Lockhart River in far north Queensland. A man in his 20s is in a critical condition, suffering from significant head and upper body injuries, while a man in his 30s is in a serious but stable condition. Both were taken to Cairns Hospital for treatment. And Australia has picked up yet another medal at the Tokyo Olympics, with Kelsey Lee Barber claiming bronze in the women's javelin. The former world champion threw 64.56 metres in the final to finish 3rd. And those are the latest stories from ABC News.
Hello, I'm Rachel Papazzoni. Welcome to Close of Business, coming to you from Kalgoorlie in Western Australia, where the 30th Annual Diggers and Dealers Mining Conference was held this week. Ahead on the program, the COVID effect on display. As reporting season kicks off, Qantas stands down thousands of workers as travel lags, but miners tipped to deliver a dividend bonanza. And the dawn of a new era for Australian resources. Lithium and other battery metals pave the way for more mining riches. Also on the program, red-hot property prices, tax breaks and negative gearing help some, while housing affordability falls further behind. But first, iron ore miner Fortescue Metals had a COVID scare at its Cloudbreak mine site in the Pilbara. In Brazil, we saw how devastating COVID was for the mining industry last year. While Fortescue boss Elizabeth Gaines says it's critical to keep the virus out of its site so they can continue to operate, she's not committing to making vaccines mandatory.
It's absolutely critical to keep COVID-19 out of mining sites. We've been very privileged to continue to operate. Even last year, in the initial stages of lockdowns across Australia, the West Australian Government did a very good job of convincing the federal government that we're an essential service. So we've been able to operate throughout. And as a result, we've made a significant contribution to the Australian economy and the West Australian economy. The fact that the government can continue to support those individuals who've been impacted, and we've seen that recently in Sydney, Melbourne and now in Queensland, with payments to support them while they've been impacted by COVID. A lot of that is due to the strength and the performance of the resources sector. So it is critically important that we continue to operate.
Last year, the resources sector was particularly at the forefront in terms of testing workers before they went out to sites. Even in some cases, I think workers that were still in the city were being tested regularly. What is FMG doing at the moment to prevent the virus getting on site?
Well, we've had numerous protocols in place in the last 18 months, including testing at the airport. We PCR-test everybody once before they went to site. In recent times, we've been relying on our testing that's on-site, so we have rapid antigen testing on-site. Anybody at one of our sites who presents with cold and flu symptoms is immediately isolated and tested. So we've got very good testing protocols in place, and we're considering bringing in testing, rapid antigen testing at the airport before flying to a Fortescue site, and we're working with the Department of Health on that.
Should the vaccine be mandatory?
We're supportive of the government's rollout of the vaccine. I do think we have a way to go yet to determine that vaccine hesitancy. The rate of vaccination in Western Australia is actually quite low at the moment, at around 16%. We've been saying for some time that we think business and the mining industry has a role to play in helping to roll out vaccination. So let's focus first on getting those people vaccinated who are eligible. We'll work out what the vaccine hesitancy rates are, and then we can determine how we take it from there.
There's been a lot of discussion this week about the decarbonisation of the globe and where mining sits within that space. FMG is also trying to I guess, expand its operations with green hydrogen. Where do you see that particular element, I guess, in that broad space?
Well, there's no doubt that this shift to clean energy is happening much more rapidly than anybody anticipated, even when we were at Diggers last year. We're putting a lot of effort and investment into this opportunity because there is no doubt that there will be significant demand for green hydrogen and green ammonia and clean energy more broadly. So the transition is happening, and for those who aren't doing it, they're actually building up some risk in their business, because whether it's ESG investors, the focus on ESG credentials, that's really important, because if you're not actually ahead of the game in terms of ESG, then you could miss out on large pools of capital. But it also means that we are actually contributing to our very significant target of being carbon neutral by 2030.
Is there a future where Fortescue is more an clean energy provider than it is an iron ore producer?
Well, we're committed to our iron ore business, and we're reinvesting in the iron ore business. We have a growth strategy. We're investing in the Iron Bridge magnetite project, and that's an investment of $3.3 to $3.5 billion for ourselves and our joint venture partner. So there's no shortage of investment in the iron ore business, and it's a highly successful business for Fortescue and for our stakeholders. We do see a future where energy and green energy plays a significant part of Fortescue in the group. And over time, that probably could actually dwarf the iron ore industry because of the global nature of that transition to green energy. But iron ore will also always be a very important part of our overall business.
Elizabeth Gaines, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Rachel.
It's miners like Fortescue that analysts expect to drive strong earnings growth for ASX-listed companies this reporting season. As profit reports begin to drop, we're about to find out if company results justify the elevated share prices. Stephanie Chalmers has more.
From the depths of the COVID recession to the recovery, it's been a big year for Australia's economy and the businesses that keep it running. This August will offer a pretty comprehensive insight into how Australia's biggest companies have fared over the last year. Around 170 of the top 200 will report their full year or half year results. Over the 2021 financial year, the share market surged to new highs. Some analysts expect the current lofty share market valuations will be justified, with earnings estimates at levels last seen in 2008. There are some sure winners, the miners, thanks to iron ore prices reaching new highs. The major players, including BHP and Fortescue, are expected to boost overall earnings, after Rio Tinto already delivered a record first half profit.
If you look at what most analysts, including ourselves, expect with regards to earnings upgrades from materials, they're quite incredible. In fact, some people believe they could be up as much as 70%.
Retailers are among the likely winners, with turnover rising strongly each month compared to a year earlier. But with shopping strips in some parts of the country emptying again, some are faring better than others.
The likes of JB Hi-Fi, Harvey Norman, Temple & Webster and Super Retail Group have benefited, but analysts say the working from home beneficiaries may have passed their peak.
It's a question of whether or not they saw a slowdown at the last couple of months.
It's no surprise that the travel sector remains heavily impacted by border closures, and these results will include the period after government support like JobKeeper was removed.
The travel and the airline sectors were that obvious recovery trade, which now appears to be delayed almost indefinitely, and there's certainly no time frame around it.
Companies, particularly the cashed-up miners, are expected to return more money to shareholders.
We're going to see quite good dividend outcomes, so I suspect in the resources sector especially, you'll continue to see balance sheet that will underpin very good dividend and potential buyback situations.
And while CBA is the only major bank to report in August, analysts are watching for special dividends or share buybacks in the financial sector too.
One thing to keep in mind is that reporting season is backward looking. This time around, there'll be a big focus on the guidance and outlook statements companies provide for the period ahead, which includes the current COVID lockdowns.
This focus on outlooks could potentially be good news for struggling sectors like travel.
It may actually therefore mean they might deliver what looks like pretty terrible numbers headline, but all of a sudden their stock goes up because they actually see better times ahead.
But the opposite could also play out, with stocks sold off despite strong results if their guidance disappoints. And some will keep their cards close to their chests.
It's very difficult if you're in corporate Australia right now, where you've got a situation with a potentially indefinite lockdown period in some of your biggest markets, for you to be able to give quite clear guidance.
Companies reporting a recovery story, but it's one that's not over yet.
In major market news this week, US payments giant Square lobbed a $39 billion offer for local buy now, pay later startup Afterpay. The biggest deal in Australian corporate history comes with the full recommendation of the Afterpay board and high hopes of a springboard for growth into the lucrative American market. But some analysts warn the industry is still in its infancy.
I think we're probably likely to see sort of more regulation in the future, which is not good. And increased competition will result in margins coming down and sort of sales as the industry matures.
The Allscript deal is a 30% premium to last week's closing share price. Afterpay shares rocketed up nearly 20% on the news on Monday. Qantas will stand down 2,500 workers in response to the extended Sydney lockdown. The decision came after the federal government announced a new bailout package for airlines. Virgin and Rex are waiting on further detail before making any decisions about their staff. Rihanna Whitson reports.
Grounded planes due to COVID border closures and Groundhog Day for Qantas workers.
We've had to make the difficult decision to temporarily stand down around 2,500 Qantas and Jetstar employees who work in our domestic operations.
The affected Qantas frontline staff, including pilots and cabin crew, will be stood down without pay. Those in lockdown areas will need to apply to Centrelink for the regular coronavirus support payments. Employees who live elsewhere will receive a new $750 a week federal government support payment for aviation workers,
which we will pass directly on to those individuals that are stood down.
There are concerns staff like baggage handlers could miss out altogether.
There'd be well in excess of 10 or 12,000 workers that have fallen into a hole here, a black hole.
Unions say the support package adds to the $1.6 billion taxpayers have already spent on keeping Qantas afloat.
The tourism industry is affected. The support should be available to all workers affected. And this is true beyond tourism. This is why we need JobKeeper too.
Qantas says the staff should be stood down for about 2 months and isn't expecting any further job losses. However, that depends on how long these lockdowns last and when states reopen borders.
There's a lot of uncertainty out there on that.
An industry's future that's up in the air.
De Grey Mining hopes to become the next big gold miner in Australia with its deposit in the Pilbara. Unlike here in the goldfields, the Pilbara is an area that's more synonymous with iron ore. But boss Glenn Jardine hopes they'll break new territory.
We have made a new discovery up there of gold, and it's in a particular type of mineralisation called an intrusion, and that leads to large-scale deposits. Whether we'll be as big as the super pit remains to be seen, but it is new for the Pilbara, and we're excited about it, and I think the people of Port Hedland are as well.
And how's the time frame going?
Yeah, really well. So we only discovered the deposit back in February, March last year. We've already put out a maiden resource of just under 7 million ounces, and we're going to release the results of a scoping study in the September quarter. So we're going at a good clip.
There's been a lot of discussion this week at the conference here about decarbonisation. We've had a lot of speakers, I guess, from that sort of field as well. Gold, I guess, fits into traditional mining. It's obviously been around for centuries. What are your plans to, I guess, stay on top of those ESG carbon emissions kind of issues?
Yeah, well, we're in a great space because, you know, we haven't been producing till now, and we're really focused on, you know, applying innovative technology to get us into, you know, a space where we're operating in a really environmentally sensitive way. And also, you know, looking towards applying, you know, green technologies, particularly around energy supply, you know, so that we can be green and gold.
Is there still a place, do you think, in the mining landscape for gold?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, gold mining, you know, relatively speaking, actually is, you know, quite an environmentally friendly and you know, low carbon footprint, you know, mining arrangement, and also gold. Has lots of uses in terms of, you know, industrial uses, like in people's mobile phones. They may not be aware of that, but there's actually gold in mobile phones. It's obviously used in the medical industry. It's also used in jewellery, but ultimately gold is, you know, the final source of currency. And you know, if I had to be given, you know, $1,000 in cash or $1,000 in gold right now, I'd take gold, particularly the way that cash is being printed. It's the ultimate store of wealth.
Do you think it will stay that way when we think about the growth of digital currency?
No, I think it will. And digital currency has had its ups and downs recently, as you may have noticed. The other thing about digital currency is it takes a lot of energy to produce it. And people often don't take that into account. So digital currency isn't particularly that green either.
Lithium is one of the most sought-after battery metals, particularly for electric vehicles, because it's so lightweight. Liontown is tipped to be the newest lithium miner in Australia. New